Einstein, who's on the spectrum. He's like, how did he, and this is something I still trying to figure out, how did he convince his colleagues at Princeton, you know, E equals MC squared, oh my God, he's running up and down the block, you know, I made this grand eureka discovery, E equals MC squared, you know, his mailman says, oh please, you know, stop, pipe down, you know. And back to that selling, you know, it's like, this is an equation of physics that's going to change the world. And it's like, oh yeah, okay, well, you know, we're still going to have rain on Thursday, you know, whatever, you know, and you just bring it back to the mundane world. You can't go there with them, and so you have this revelations, you have these ideas, you have these thoughts that breaks through the mold, and that's just how we think. It just breaks through. It's the Asperger's person who created the light, and they had the creations and the locomotives and the trains and the computers. The computer, all about computers, is all. The whole construction of it has its history with people with Asperger's. So all of the technology and the science and the inventions and so forth is clearly it's the gift. And people who have that is like, okay, well, I have this idea, it's different, it's unique, it's novel, novice, and you have to find somebody to match that up with and who can recognize its value. And then you work collectively with that. A research project, through my own experiences and having spoke with so many other fellow Aspies about the struggle of employment, knowing that even the research is constantly replicating numbers like we are 90% underemployed or unemployed. From an Asperger's point of view, I thought that my contribution was to create a tool, a questionnaire to people on the spectrum about how we view work, how we are viewed at the work site, most importantly, and our attitudes regarding work and the work site. Asking questions that I know, just having living with this, and that I know that we're contemplating about work. And that's been really helpful. You know, I've seen results like it's very, very important for us to be seen as different. You know, and again, you know, we live in a society where everybody wants to conform and uniform. So we have results like that. We have results like, I want to be seen as being intelligent. I want to be seen as having unique ideas, as opposed to, you know, what you might expect, you know, from a person who's a neurotypical individual looking for work. It begins to give us understanding about where the company really needs to begin to think that this person needs some autonomy. You know, this person needs to be able to have some room to be able to do the job according to how they see things, and to draw in their own creative ways of understanding it. And I believe that will be ultimately the results of the research that I'm working on.
There are stories of people who work well on a job, but don't always last in that job because they couldn't get along socially with the people in that job. There are times in my life where I've even had to leave groups because I couldn't get along with those people socially, even though the interest of the topic of the group was something that I liked. And sometimes a person with autism has to do that. You know, we're told in our social classes, in our classes, don't give up. But sometimes it's better to give up. We're told don't quit. But the key to success lies not in quitting or not quitting, but knowing when to not quit and when to quit. If something isn't working and you've tried to make it work and it still isn't working, sometimes it's better to move on. And I think that's one thing that we need to be more willing to teach people in schools and parents, and to teach this more to their children. The right time when it is best to quit and not go forward.
Most of my employers have been supportive of my son being autistic. In the past, it got a little scary at times because back then there were more times when we had daycares calling us up saying, you've got to come pick up your kid right now because he just beat up a teacher. And so I'd have to go to my boss and say, I have to leave, my son beat up a teacher at daycare. So It was kind of scary at that time, thinking that I was going to get in trouble, get fired. I decided to apply for intermittent FMLA. It's like family medical leave, but what it is you get to leave whenever you need to, for however length of time you need, and it doesn't count as like an unexcused absence. They were very against my applying for the intermittent FMLA. And when I did apply for it, not long after that, I got laid off. Other than that, the place I work now, they seem to be very understanding about it. I think that some companies are more understanding than others. A lot of them don't understand. They're like, well, he's just got Asperger's, so what's the big deal? I mean, it's not like you need to go home and take care of a kid who's like wheelchair bound or, you know, all this stuff. You know, he's a normal, he can walk, he can talk, he can feed himself. You know, why do you have to take care of this child? Well, they don't get it.
Asperger's is an invisible disability. What that means is that when someone looks at someone, they can't necessarily automatically tell that they have Asperger's, as opposed to if someone has like a wheelchair or something, then they can tell that that person is handicapped.
Let me start with the visible disability, and that is the source of a lot of pain. When you ask somebody who's Asperger's, what a lot of the struggles, some people might even use the word suffering, that we've gone through, it's that you have individuals who come into our lives and see our behaviors outside of a vacuum and not have the perspective about knowing what it is that we're dealing with, having this different perspective. And when they see that, they're labeling that as, you know, well, you're just being odd, you're just being weird, you're just being stupid, you're just being crazy, and why are you so weird? And empower themselves. And all of us have noticed that we've been victimized by the judgments that others have had because they just empower themselves, like, stop acting out, and why don't you just act right, or something like that, and shaming us publicly because they don't recognize that we're living on the spectrum. And that invisibility gives them the right to feel like, okay, well, if I could just make this person reel this person in and have them conform to societal expectations and traditions, that's good enough, because that's what generally you will do with somebody who's developmentally not at that point yet. Then it's shame because I'm an adult, I know how to handle myself, I have independence. I may not have the concept that I should act differently, and other people would view me in this light.
It's tough because of all these difficulties. I went to an autism conference, and a lot of people there were frustrated that Asperger's people have to struggle so hard and adapt, and we aren't getting met halfway. I hadn't thought about it before, but Asperger's is a minority, and instead of the victim mentality, we need to step up and advocate for ourselves to become better. Asperger's people need to develop the skills so they're valuable, and then what needs to happen is they need to get put into jobs that match up with those skills so they can be productive and valuable members of society. On the other hand, with hiring managers, stereotypically, if they haven't heard of Asperger's or autism, they're going to just assume that it's just, oh, some mentally retarded person, and we don't want to work with them. But if they have heard of autism, then they can put the person with those skills into the job that matches up with those skills, and then they'll start to see the benefits of having an autistic employee. They are reliable, logical, honest, loyal, they pay attention to detail, and they're likely to thrive on routines and clear expectations.
One of my first jobs was working guest services at our local pool, and the lady there, she knew I had Asperger's, so she knew how to adjust to me. She knew how to tell me how to do this and what I should do.
One of the struggles that I have is because I think in novel ways, in different ways, creative ideas and so forth, my boss have to find ways of explaining to my coworkers, well, that's just Paul being Paul. Basically, you know, wherever I'm working, my supervisor's going to work with the other staff. And that's Paul being Paul. It's a struggle to make it not sound like we have to have separate rules for him. Whether you disclose or not, or your coworkers know that you're on the spectrum or not, it's going to sometimes appear as if Your work site is going to have separate rules for you because you're working differently. And, you know, we're going back again to just straight up accommodations. If you have a coworker that's in a wheelchair, you're going to have to open the room. You're going to have the door. You're going to have to create a ramp. You're going to have an elevator. You know what I'm saying? And that's not separate rules. I mean, we all could use the ramp. We all could use the elevator. These are accommodations that are necessary for this person to, for us to enjoy this person's talents. And those who will bounce other people's criticisms and comments back against me. Well, such and such person says this happened and that happened, and it might be an interpretation of my behavior, not necessarily behavior, interpretation of it, and then I'm having to explain, well, then they'll say, well, why did you do such and such, or don't you know that was wrong, or something like that, and I'm like, I'm put on the spot and having to get defensive, you know, about something in which somebody else is making, you know, interpretations about the behaviors that I do. And that's a real struggle. That's a real struggle. And so it has to do with the advocacy of your supervisor and knowing what you have. And as one of my friends say, there's no defense against excellence. If you're really, really, really good at your job, then they're going to want to hold you and keep you because your excellence speaks for itself, and they see the value in keeping you there.
Work is not something that's guaranteed. We all have to work unless we're independently wealthy to make money, to support ourselves, or to get what we want or what we need. No law, be it Title IX or the Americans with Disabilities Act, no law will protect a worker if they cannot perform the functions of the job, even with modifications. If you can't perform the job, you can be fired. What those laws do is they protect you if you are able to perform the job with modifications. One of the sad things about job interviews and job applications is that no job application is going to tell you the sensory requirements of a job. For example, if you're looking for a teacher's aide, it's not going to say as part of the requirements must be able to tolerate fire drills. At the same time, too, people have to be realistic. If there's a limitation that they have to deal with, like suppose they have a health issue that stops them from going to work at times because they get sick. Suppose they have a budget where they can only socialize for certain amounts of time and then they just reach their limit and get overwhelmed. When looking for work, you have to be clear to yourself, what can I handle? Be it a social issue, a sensory issue, a health issue, a digestive issue, a hormonal issue. Any of those things can cause issues when you're going to work. I got my first job at a Dairy Queen, failed miserably, was out in a week and a half. What happened? I was not able to meet some of the skills required for the job. Due to my motor skill deficits, I could not make the ice cream cones the way I was supposed to. Finally, the boss said, if we don't see a drastic change in your performance, we're going to have to let you go. And I said, you know what? It's not going to happen. I'm leaving today. And I left. One of the issues that I think we need to talk about is, how do we help people with autism if we want them to find independence through employment? How can we help them find work that gives them enough money to be independent? One of the things, especially in the current economy we're living in, is that there's a lot of people who are employed, but not all of them are able to be independent. We think of employment as independence as synonyms. They are not. The cost of living is higher when you have autism. That might come as a shock to many people, but think about it logically. Many people with autism, they're on special diets. They need counseling or some very expensive therapy, or might be on some very expensive medication, be it for a health issue or a psychological need. All that increases the amount of money you need to live. Some people with autism need to have special sensory toys like weighted blankets or vests. They are not cheap. At the same time, too, it's not illegal, even today, to pay people with disabilities less than people without disabilities. Therein lies the important thing we have to ask. If employment does not provide for independence, how do we teach employers to make that a reality? Also, if we're living in a world as we currently are, where people with autism often have to be unemployed, to get government assistance and benefits so that they can get their health needs met, how do we accept that reality? How do we stop judging people who have to be on government assistance to get by when employment isn't helping them? Because one thing I've seen traveling this country, we're living in a world where government assistance often provides more than employment, yet people are often stigmatized for being on government assistance. How do we end that stigma? But at the same time, how do we help people find jobs if they are able to that enable them to support themselves? Because right now, most of the young adults I see living independently are getting disability or an SSI check. Very few of the adults I meet who are in their 20s and 30s are living independently through employment. There are some exceptions, but they are the exception, not the norm. And if they are often being supported either through a spouse or someone who is helping them.